Whether you're thinking of starting a podcast, you've just launched, or you're a seasoned podcast pro, you might be asking yourself the question, does my podcast need editing? Let's find out. Hey everyone, Joe here. So I'm going to start things off by going over exactly what podcast editing entails. Some podcasters do it, some podcasters just upload their raw audio, their raw recordings. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of editing, and then I'll give you the verdict on whether or not you should be editing your podcast. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to give away something for free that you as a podcaster will really benefit from. It will save you time, it will save you money, so keep an eye out for that. So firstly, a brief explanation. Essentially, the editing stage is the part that comes after the recording stage. It's about tweaking your recording to ensure that it sounds as good as possible and that it's as engaging as possible for the listener. Podcast editing can include cutting out clicks, pops, desk taps, coughs, any other unwanted sounds, removing verbal crutches like, shortening dead air, that's long gaps of silence, and improving coherence, so getting rid of mistakes, repeated words, stuttering, and maybe moving things around a little bit to make it flow better. So restructuring, tidying up overly complicated, overly explained questions or answers, things like that. Some podcasts might involve all of this and more. Some edits might not be required at all. It depends on how the podcast was recorded and also the goals of the podcaster. For clarity, podcast mixing is about making tonal changes and balancing things out so it sounds better. Podcast mastering is the final stage to get it ready for upload, download. In this video, we're just talking about the editing stage. You might be asking, can't you just upload it as it is though, how it was recorded on the day? Some podcasters prefer not to edit, and let's have a look at the reasons why they might choose to do that. Firstly, it takes time. It's going to take you longer to edit the podcast than it is to even record it. It's often the longest part of it. And if you just want to get your message out there, your episode out there, then you might not want to spend a few hours editing. Secondly, it can cost money. If you don't want to spend the time on it, you want to outsource, then it's going to cost you. It's going to be some overheads. And if you don't advertise in your podcast yet, then that's going to be coming out of your pocket. Some podcasters feel they lose authenticity if they edit, if they change what they've said, they move things around. And finally, some podcasters just don't see the benefit. They don't feel that it improves the experience for the listener making edits. So let's go over these reasons not to edit and find out if they're worth considering or if they're just misconceptions. So yes, editing does take time. For an amateur editor, it can take up to 3 times the length of the podcast to make the edits, or even more for some. But it depends how serious you are. If you really want your podcast to grow, then it's important that you put that time in, because it's kind of false economy. If you're not putting that time in to make the episodes as good as they can be up front, then it's going to be harder to gain traction. If you're going to put in all those hundreds of hours planning and interviewing guests and recording, then you really don't want to be rushing the final stage of that. But if you really don't have the time, then you can consider outsourcing. Which brings us on to the second point, that it costs money to outsource your podcast editing. And if you're not making money on the podcast, or you're an individual, you're not doing a business podcast, so there's no investment in there, then yeah, it can cost a fair amount to get your episodes edited every single week. But as soon as you start making a little bit of money on the advertising, rather than taking that as profit, I'd recommend putting it straight back into the podcast, because it will help it grow. And it's better to think of things long term. Think of investing early on to get the podcast sounding as good as it can be, as professional as it can be, to help it to start growing exponentially. And also, podcast editing prices vary a lot. There are some podcast editors that will charge sort of up to $200 an episode. And there are also, on the other end of the spectrum, really, really cheap podcast editors who might not do any better than you could do in 10 minutes. But there are some editors that will do a really professional job. They'll listen to the entire podcast and make it sound fantastic for not a huge amount of money. And then thirdly, some podcasters are concerned about retaining authenticity. They feel that by editing what they're saying, it's not raw, it's not how they speak. But editing isn't censorship. We're not taking away from the message. In fact, it ensures that there's more focus on your message by removing ums and ahs. And, when you're on the day, when you're recording, it's different from when you're just having a conversation with someone. It's harder to get your questions out a lot of the time, especially if you're speaking with an interviewee who you admire. It can be harder to get your words together. And just by tidying things up, for the listener, they don't notice these edits. All they're hearing is you and your message. It'll still feel like you if you have a good editor, that is, who makes these transparent edits that they can't notice. It will help remove distractions and bring more focus on your message. And again, if you're working with a good editor, they'll work with you to ensure that they're editing in a way that you like. So if you want to keep in a lot of the pauses for emotional effect, if you want a more laid back approach, or if you want something really tight and professional and as short as possible to keep the listener engaged right until the end of the episode, whatever you want, if you find yourself a good editor, they will make that happen for you. And finally, some podcasters just don't see a benefit. They don't think the audience will prefer an edited episode over their normal episodes. And very, very occasionally that might be right. If you know your audience really well, you've got a long-standing audience that's been with you for years and years, and they get your style. But for most of you, it will probably be that you want to be getting new listeners. And there are so many podcasts out there now, and a lot of your potential listeners, they don't have time to listen to 10 minutes of rambling before the episode starts. They might not have time to listen to a 2-hour episode every single week. If your message is on point and it's something they really want to hear, and it's way longer than it needs to be, it's drawn out, then it can really put people off from even getting started with your podcast. Podcast editing can put across a more professional image, it can increase listener retention rates, and it can help you to stand out from the crowd. Ultimately, if you want to take your podcast to the next level and stand out from the other 2 million or so podcasts out there, then you really need to be editing your podcast, whether that's outsourcing to a professional podcast editor or if you're editing it yourself. Yes, over-editing can sound unnatural and obvious to the listener if it's done badly, but a careful and transparent edit, it's just going to be giving the listener what they want and help them to focus on your message. If you literally have no time at all spare and no money to outsource, then maybe it's going to be difficult for you to get your podcast edited every week. But in that situation, it might be worth thinking if you have enough time for podcasting at all. Obviously, it's best to just get stuff out there and get started. But editing is part of the whole process. And if you can make just a little bit of extra time for your podcast, even if it's just to get rid of some of the dead air and some of the worst offending noises and verbal crutches and things, even if you can just spend 15-20 minutes on each episode, it will do wonders for your podcast growth. So that's it from me today. If you do have a podcast and you don't have a huge amount of time, then feel free to head to joecrowaudio.com or click on the link in the description, and I will edit one episode of your podcast for free. No strings attached, no obligations. One episode edited completely for free to a professional standard. And for more podcast audio tips and tutorials, then hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.